Hi, and welcome to the New Statesman podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the Conservative Party's woman problem, and then in You Ask Us, why Labour has never elected a female leader. I mean, it was International Women's Day yesterday, so these are important topics to talk about. Let's start with the Tories. Before 2020, women were more likely to vote Tory than men were, but since 2015, women have been supporting Labour in higher numbers, to the point where women are far more likely to vote Labour than Tory in 2023, we think. Then again, the Tories have had 3 women as Prime Minister and Labour have never elected a female leader. Zoe, you've been writing about this. Your piece headlined, "Have the Conservatives Done Enough for Women?" is well worth a read, so I suggest our listeners go and have a look at that. Can you outline what you found in your reporting? Because, I remember writing about David Cameron's woman problem. This has been something that's been dogging the Tories for a really long time. Also writing that Ed Miliband, when he was leader of Labour, was, way ahead in polling among women voters. But then the Tories have won election after election. So is there really a women problem? And what shape is it taking?
So I think it's probably important to say, firstly, the Conservatives would probably say they don't have a women problem. So they would point to, as you said, their 3 female prime ministers, especially in comparison to Labour, obviously, who's had none. They'd also talk about some of their pledges, so their 2019 manifesto pledge to fight crime against women and girls and provide support for victims of rape and sexual abuse. Sunak himself often talks about, how committed he is to ending Vogue. Talks about his daughters and his wife. They've also introduced a women's health strategy, which they did in July last year, and a women's health champion. So that's kind of looking at making smaller the inequality gap in terms of women's health and looking at kind of reproductive health issues as well. Also, obviously, on the self-ID debate, they would say that the reason they are kind of questioning self-ID legislation is because the way it impacts female-only spaces. But I think it doesn't take that long to kind of look at a lot of these, especially the manifesto pledges, and see how they kind of fall apart. So when we look at violence against women and girls, the statistics really speak for themselves. Somewhere between 2 to 3 women a week are killed in the UK by a partner, ex-partner or family member, which is a huge number. And yesterday in the Chamber, Jess Phillips read out a list, the Counting Dead Women list. 97% of women experience sexual harassment in their lifetime, and about 1 in 4 women are raped. So it's an issue that really impacts a whole lot of women in the UK. However, the Conservatives voted against making misogyny a hate crime. Yesterday in the Chamber, again, the Minister called it virtue signalling. Obviously, there's been issues with the police force, but there's been no real police reform. So they've now made it a strategic policing requirement to look at tackling Vogue, but again, it's not very kind of substantiated. And there does seem to be this kind of refusal to properly kind of reform police at the minute, or just a kind of lack of real action there. And then, that doesn't even take into account things like childcare, menopause action, and of course, the gender pay gap as well, which is now at 15%. So when you actually look at their track record on women's issues, it doesn't seem to be an awful lot that we can actually point to and say they've really made improvements in this area.
Right. And the trend is going in the wrong direction, isn't it? So the gender pay gap has actually widened. There are more parents having to fall out of the workforce because of the expense of childcare. And then, of course, you've got the problems in the criminal justice system as well. So just 1% of rapes result in a conviction now. And the average wait for a rape case to go to court is 3 years. So all of these things, you can say that misogyny and violence against women is a problem within society. But some of these signifiers show that it's getting worse for women living in Britain rather than better, which is something, part of which we should be able to lay at the government's door.
I think that's right. And I think it's also worth kind of thinking about how the party is seen in terms of female representation. So for a start, I think it's something like 70% of Conservative Party MPs are male. And then when you kind of look
it's high, isn't it?
It is high. When you look at their front bench, it's something like, taking into account all ministers, not just cabinet ministers, it's like, a third of females. And then when you look at kind of when the Prime Minister or Number 10 sends a minister out on to broadcast for the media round, it's something like 1 in 9 minutes in his first 100 days has been a female minister kind of going out there making the government's case. So I think they're kind of in some ways as a party creating a problem for themselves in that they aren't showing that they have women in their party. They aren't kind of putting that representation out there to say, we are a male and female party. So, and I think that kind of will come back to bite them eventually.
And I suppose it does make a difference to how voters view them, because there's 2 ways of talking about the women problem, isn't there? It's sort of what they're doing for women policy-wise, but also how they're appealing to women in the electorate. And the polling does suggest that Labour is a lot more popular with women voters than the Conservatives are. And this is something that was very stark when it was Keir Starmer versus Boris Johnson. You know, I heard from Labour's private polling that they were finding that Starmer was actually quite popular with women, and there was like a big gap between how women felt about him and Boris Johnson. I wonder if it would quite be the same with Rishi Sunak. He seems to get a sort of warmer reception in terms of the public, and like you say, he talks a lot about his family, and there's been those pictures over Christmas of them baking together and things.
Sunak probably has a better PR perception when it comes to women than Boris Johnson did, not least because some of the, you know, pretty offensive comments Johnson made about, you know, single parent, female parents and what have you. But I think sort of beyond that, when you look at kind of how women might vote, they're probably like most other voters going to vote with their pocket, you know, and they've been kind of hit harder by cost of living crisis, hit harder by austerity when George Osborne and David Cameron were in charge. I think that's kind of expressed today when you look at what's happening in terms of the strikes. You know, most of the people that are on strike the majority of them are women, because the pay crisis that we've got in the country at the minute is hitting female professions. So you look at, you know, it's nurses, it's teachers. I sometimes think in a lot of the coverage, the rail strikes are outsized in terms of how much coverage they get, because that it causes so much disruption. But it's a lot of the professions affected at the minute are female professions, and they're on strike because their pay is not good enough. It's not keeping pace with the cost of living. So, you know, I think that's something that's probably not considered enough.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I think that ties into a general thing that I'm hearing quite a lot from people sort of in and around the political sphere, that is the women are angry, which sounds kind of sexist, but I think it is, you know, there is a grain of truth in it. I remember when I was interviewing Jolie Brearley, who runs Pregnant Then Screwed, that has had a few policy wins and is sort of quite a prominent pressure group at the moment. She was saying sort of women are just really pissed off, and what made them angry, particularly mothers, was during the lockdowns, sort of supervising the home learning, and we had a lot of, you know, evidence that the pandemic was affecting women's ability to concentrate on their work more than it was men's, and, you know, all sorts of horrible stats about how much you know, housework people were doing in mixed couples, etc. And she was saying that sort of politicised quite a lot of women of a certain generation who otherwise, like, she's an example, she would give herself as an example, people who hadn't seen themselves as political before. And there was a really good article about this on the New Statesman website by Eliza Philby, who's a historian of generations. The headline is "Why Rishi Sunak Ought to Beware of Prosecco Mums," which sounds quite patronising, but is a really interesting piece about sort of exennial mums, sort of demographic who grew up with girl power and are feeling sort of a little bit angry and let down by the government as they've come to have children and start families and, you know, rise up, you know, into higher positions in the workplace and realise how unequal it is. What this writer has been arguing is that Prosecco mum could be the new Mondeo man or the new Worcester woman, you know, these demographic types that we say might swing the next election.
I love the idea of Prosecco mums. I think what's kind of, it's Zoe kind of touched it on it a little bit before, but like childcare is such a huge issue. I mean, there's a reason why Labour's talking about it absolutely all of the time at the moment, and is making a huge deal of the childcare policy, which the Shadow Education Secretary is kind of starting to unveil step by step. We've got sort of like some of the most expensive childcare in the Western world. The way that breaks down in terms of its impact is that it ends up that women are staying at home and making sacrifices in terms of their career. So where there might have been social mobility in the past, that's kind of being nipped in the bud for some families. And yeah, I think you're right. That's causing a lot of anger, and it's going to make it a big electoral issue. And when you add that to things like the housing crisis, the push down on pay that we've seen, I think, you know, I mean, a lot of people will be understandably angry, you could argue, yeah.
I do think it's interesting the Conservatives almost seem to be kind of alienating several different demographics or several different age groups, actually. Because, yeah, you've got the childcare issue, which is, you know, impacting sort of younger women of a childbearing age. But then also you have the Vogue issue. I mean, women across generations are going to be really affected by that, especially younger women. I mean, we saw the Everyone's Invited school scandal, and as we see women kind of moving into work, the inability to kind of get a handle on harassment and sexual violence and issue with policing. I mean, that's something that young women are really concerned about. But then you also have menopause care, and this is something that's really taken off in the last kind of year. People are finally talking about it. So you've got MPs like Carolyn Harris and Caroline Noakes who have really drawn attention to this issue. And part of their argument is this is also a workforce issue, because a lot of women are leaving the workplace when they get to menopause age because employers aren't, appropriately supporting them. So you not only have women leaving the workplace because they can't afford childcare, but then you also have women who are older leaving the workplace because of menopause. And in that way, they're kind of alienating several generations of women. And it's like, you know, what group of women are they supporting? What group of women are going to be supported by Conservative policies?
And it's an economic issue, isn't it? Because if you are losing women, like you say, at the age that they start having children from the workplace, you're losing workers. And we heard only this morning that businesses are really concerned about this issue. But then also look at the group that are leaving the workforce the fastest. It's over 50s, isn't it? The government at the moment are trying to get those people to come back into work and not to retire early. And of course, you know, if menopausal women feel that their symptoms are affecting their focus on work, then they're going to carry on leaving unless there are structures put in place in the workforce. And that's something the government recently rejected, the idea of menopause leave and also having, you know, menopause as a protected characteristic under the Equality Act.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I watched Kemi Badenoch, the government's Minister for Equalities, at her committee hearing the other day, where the cross-party group kind of examines her work, takes a look at how the government's doing on some of these issues. It's kind of, she has like quite a political response rather than like engaging with some of the arguments. So, for example, Carolyn Harris, who's a sort of campaigning MP, was asking about whether the government would take the cross-party committees' recommendation to look at menopause leave. And Kemi Badenoch's response was to kind of be like, well, why would I accept what she called a left-wing idea? And I think that's kind of like, that makes something that's not necessarily divisive a divisive issue when you start to just engage with the idea of improving gender equality as just purely a political idea. I mean,
even though the select committee recommending it is a cross-party,
chaired by a Conservative MP. Yeah.
But I think there's, I mean, like, on the other hand, there's kind of like, there's the reactionary view where you could say that the debate around gender equality is becoming divisive in some areas and difficult for other groups. But I just think, you know, if you're the government and engaging, you're expected to engage on it as a government which represents everybody. I think calling it a left-wing issue is kind of just bad PR for the party in government.
And we were discussing earlier, Anoosh, that, you know, the way that the government is kind of framing this issue, it's almost becoming a bit of a culture war issue, you know, this kind of war on woke and gender equality. And
it's virtue signalling.
It's a virtue signalling, yeah. There was a lot of language like that in questions yesterday.
Sometimes it is about signalling, isn't it? It is about sort of showing where your priorities are and sort of where your loyalties are. And if we do, you know, feel that our ministers aren't taking it seriously or are dismissing it as a politicised issue or a woke issue, that's not going to impress, you know, someone who feels like they can't up their hours or, you know, go from part-time to full-time or like get back into the workplace. That doesn't make sense to them. You know, this is an issue that's affecting businesses and the economy. It's not just something that, not that there's anything wrong with it, but it's not something that just, you know, female-led pressure groups are getting riled up about. This is something that is affecting all of society. And so I think it is important in terms of the signal that it shows. And, you know, it is a little bit of an irony if we're only hearing that rhetoric about how much we care about women's safety and women-only spaces when it's linked to the trans rights debate.
Yeah, I think the trans rights debate is like obviously a massive issue, but it does, in terms of it will affect society, how we legislate for improving trans rights. I think it's become kind of overly politicised, and people have probably lost sight that it does affect a very small group of people, and are probably missing the wider debate around gender equality overall, and in terms of how that affects the economy and how that's affecting families, how that's affecting a wider number of people.
Thanks so much, Rachel and Zoe. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch more videos that are on the screen now.